So we're going to be introducing our first speaker to the podium, and his name is Dr. Stanley H. Griffin. He's head of department and senior lecturer in Archival and Information Studies in the Department of Library and Information Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona Campus, Jamaica. He holds a BA with honors in history and a PhD in cultural studies with high commendation from the University of the West Indies, Cape Hill campus. He also holds an MSc in Archives and Records Management International from the University of Dundee, Scotland. Dr. Griffin began his archival career at the University of the West Indies, Cape Hill campus, serving the university Archives and Records Management program. In 2018, he became a lecturer in the Archives and Records Department, or rather, in Archives and Records Management, taking on several leadership roles within the Department of Library and Information Studies and the Faculty of Humanities and Education as Deputy Dean for Undergraduate Matters. Since becoming head of department in 2024, he has led a major transformation of the department through the review, renew, and revitalize strategy, introducing new academic programs to the DLIS Information Institute, the new micro-credential learning arm. A prolific scholar, he has produced numerous publications, technical reports, and presented keynote lectures regionally and internationally. His research focuses on Caribbean archives, cultural memory, migration, and community archives. And he has supervised more than 45 graduate research projects in areas of history and Caribbean heritage, archival studies, cultural studies, library studies, and theology. So today, Dr. Griffin's lecture will be delivered, and the title of the lecture is The West Indies Must Be West Indian, Redefining the Space, Content, and Extent of Caribbean Archives and Memory. Welcome, Dr. Griffin.
Thank you very much. There we are. Well, good morning to everyone. Good morning to everyone. Right, I trust you're all wide awake and ready to delve into all the things Heritage Connection has to offer us together. Standing on the protocol established by my friend Marsha, I wish to recognize my duly senior leadership and colleagues, as well as to give thanks to Amelia, and Pauline, and all the colleagues at Heritage, as well as the sponsors for giving me this honor to deliver this opening keynote. I also want to thank Marsha for your very kind introduction. I'm really hoping our time this morning will be informative, thought-provocative, and hopefully we'll have a bit of fun. Now, before I set off on the full conversation, I want to do something that is not the usual practice in our Caribbean academic circles. I wish to declare my positionality. The questions and concerns on our minds this morning for the symposium that may have brought us together are not new and have been my own personal and professional quest since beginning to work in the archives, in the Caribbean archives sector since 2005. The questions were a central theme in my own archival studies master's research paper, in which I argued in 2015 that for the Caribbean, quote, the archival record-keeping sphere may be the last bastion of colonialism in the region that is yet to experience the social and political changes that the English-speaking Caribbean societies have undergone at that point over the last 50 years. So coming to archival work as a PhD student in cultural studies, I grappled with this dichotomy that Caribbean archivists and institutions face, and which we will consider this morning. One, what really are the archives of the Caribbean? Is it just the colonial documents, files from the various centuries that are in our repositories? Two, how can we make our archives built on these colonial materials that were not necessarily flattering to our current populations, relevant to the new nations that emerged from colonialism into independence, and for some places, into republicanism? Three, what about the other memory details not found in the textual formats? The questions become even more relevant for me when in 2018, I was appointed lecturer in archival studies for the new archival studies master's program that I've taught in the department as an adjunct since 2015. With its mandate of educating Caribbean-born and based archivists and records managers, and that the program must be inherently Caribbean, I had to make 3 personal and educational commitments. My positionality. I am teaching Caribbean archives primarily to those who will return to their territorial nations to serve in archival roles, both within and outside the government archives. 2, that these Caribbean-born and educated archivists and records managers are not merely to be collectors, collators, or purveyors of colonial materials and memory. And 3, more importantly, these Caribbean-born and educated archivists and records managers must pick up the mantle from their first generation in some territories, second and third generation archivists in other places to develop and to revolutionize by expanding the concept, roles, and holdings of their national archives. Let me see if this can work. There we go. So thankfully, university statistics reveal that this year, in our 10th year of delivery, the University Archives and Archival Studies program has graduated 58 Master of Arts graduates in Archives and Records Management from across the region, the Bahamas, right down to Suriname. There's never been this many archivists present in most of the English-speaking Caribbean and Suriname before in our sectoral history. And while their professional advancement has been slow, they've been trickling their way upwards to positions of influence in the region. So this brings me to the title and focus of my presentation this morning. The West Indies must be West Indian, redefining the scope and content and extent of Caribbean archives and memory. It really asks us to consider 2 things. 1, what are the identifiers of Caribbean archives? What makes an archival expression not just a textual document Caribbean? And 2, what features these expressions bear? My aims, therefore, are for us to think about 3 matters: the identities, the materials, and the capacity for care for the future of Caribbean archives. The archives is held as a monolith of memory in any given society. It is seen as a place where official documentation of past and present, however perceived and described, are kept for the benefit of society. Stuart Hall presents an idea that the elements of national heritage, a term he debates intensely, are inherently exclusive. While in his writing, Stuart focuses on the cabinets of curiosities and wonder, namely museum objects, built environment, works of art, and places of historical interest. I want to, for the purposes of our conversation this morning, squeeze in the usually forgotten records and archives. Hall argues that these various elements of heritage are preserved and celebrated because they project and are the embodiment of officially endorsed narratives. These stories are the sources and representations of tradition, power, and authority. For this reason, archival records and institutions form part of a continuum of static influence, joining other heritage elements, sectors, such as a fortress, a cannonball, or a museum, with its fixed content, context, and structure. For us in the Caribbean, as former colonial societies, we perceive the archives as painful relics of the past, representations of past harmful powers, and the foundational materials of our past and present under development and oppression. Caribbean archives mirror the histories, peoples, memory practices, and archival traditions that make up the Caribbean. Yet, the discipline and practice are rooted in the colonial experiences of the region, and as a distinct professional activity, we are still fairly young. Colonial rule determined the definition of records and the ways in which the archives are managed and made accessible to this very day. The very mechanics of archival work are further complicated by the wide variety of formats and provenances of the records and archives and collections, by the stipulation or lack thereof of legislation, and the prevailing information implications of the economic, socio-political, and cultural dynamics of the day. The Caribbean, with its indigenous peoples and various African, Asians, and Europeans that came or were forcibly brought to work and live in the region, also influenced what was documented as records, as well as other expressions of memory. Thus, the cultural diversity in the Caribbean results in multiple documentary expressions and formats, things we used to call culture. And as a culturalist, I could tell you it took us years to recognize that these expressions were valid cultural expressions, right? Not low culture, not mimic men, but actual cultural practices. We are yet to recognize that these are information creating, documentation, preservation actions. Nevertheless, we acknowledge them this morning as memory. Thus, this question of Caribbean archival praxis goes straight to the heart of determining and representing Caribbean identities. After all, these archives are articulations and expressions of the politics of identities that shape the region over the time and in the here and now. The idea of the uniqueness in the characteristics and dynamics of those born in the region goes back for centuries, starting with the then considered judgmental term Creole, Criollo. It was a phrase imposed on those born in the colonies by those from metropolitan European nations who noticed differences, however subtle, between those from or living in the Caribbean and those from Europe. This clash of identities, one may argue, underlines the ways in which records about the Caribbean were created, used, maintained, and valued. Have a look at the diaries and the ways in which they wrote about their experiences interacting with the locals. You could check the blogs too. The more things change, the more they remain the same. This identity question, I argue, is the basis for the challenges faced by Caribbean archives. It has also been an established fact that generally Caribbean people do not see themselves or use our archives. Former archivist of St. Kitts and Nevis, the late Victoria O'Flaherty, noted, over the 3.5 centuries of colonization, the island acquired a valuable archives which has only rarely been explored, leading many locals to believe that it does not even exist. Vicky went further by saying, since power and the ability to create archives rested with the island's elite, the records naturally reflect the events they felt were important, and the matters deemed important for the subjugated were ignored. In other words, Caribbean people, dare I say Creole, born and raised in the region, need their own archives. I want us to reflect on the vision and writings of a West Indian from Grenada who preached a mantra that informs today's title. The West Indies must be West Indian. Theophilus Albert Marichaud. T.A. Marichaud was a Federalist who felt that the challenges of colonialism could be surmounted and surpassed by education, agitation, and federation. In 1915, he launched his newspaper after years of working with other established Grenadian newspapers, entitled The West Indian, with the slogan, the West Indies must be West Indian. This influenced shaped the formation of regionalism in the English-speaking Caribbean. On screen is a scan of a plate found in the holdings of the Federal Archives that I saved and mounted in my cubicle while I was working there as archives assistant. It was commissioned by the federal government. As you'll notice, the federal coat of arms is surmounted therein. Marichaud preached an identity that we still grapple with in our regional politics and movement. However, an idea was birthed. Sir Shuda Thramphal, another distinguished Caribbean Federalist, described Marichaud's ideology in this way. In the slogan was a double entendre. If to be West Indian was to both a goal of self-determination and a strategy for reaching and sustaining it. Friends, I think this is still the struggle of Caribbean archives. One, to advance from our colonial formations and foundational roles. 2, to really strategize to better document and reflect our present-day communities. Thus, the first act of redefining Caribbean archives and memory is to establish a governing principle, and by action, that even Caribbean archives must be Caribbean. And dare I add, it must be present in the Caribbean. Now, on to this business of scope and content. I will always say to archival students, the hallmark of archival work and the defining ability of a good archivist is their ability to identify the values of the materials, the values in the materials, and to make those values not just content, accessible and usable by users, and to accurately fill out the section on the processing form. The ability to connect user with record is the purpose of our work. To connect the user's research to the meanings acted out or inscribed on record, quite frankly, is our bread and butter. In archival processing, the question of scope and content is a mandatory yet fundamental one. This is where the keywords, the names, the dates, the topics, the themes that the researcher is after connects with records. The Society of American Archivists Archival Dictionary describes the scope and content element as a narrative statement, summarizing the characteristics of the described materials, the functions and activities that produce them, and the types of information contained therein. In other words, scope and content gives the necessary details for engagement and relevance for access and use. Caribbean archival institutions typically use the ICA, International Council on Archives, International Standard for General Archival Description, ISARG. And their definition gives a more precise explanation of its purpose: to enable users to judge the potential relevance of a unit of description. And this is done by giving a summary of the scope, that is, the time, the periods, the geography, for example, and content. What documentary forms, subject matter, administrative processes of the unit. In other words, you just get a class in archival description. Or as my library friends would say, archival cataloging. I want us to pay attention to that phrase, documentary forms in red. This is a challenge for Caribbean archives because in essence, in considering the materials and expressions not in paper form and in the national institution, these documentary forms are excluded. They're outside. And the diversity in the ways in which we document ourselves and create memory are not necessarily represented in the repository. We need to include these memory forms in our scope and content because, quite frankly, they are also related to the other textual records therein. Archivist Vern Harris out of South Africa argues that the archives is just a sliver of social memory, and the archival residue in documents is but a sliver of the documentary record. The repository is simply a representation, a sample of all the documentation and memory practices that is outside the repository and actively created in society. He further maintains that our archival processing and preservation is simply prolonging the usefulness and value of the preserved sliver of social memory. The archival collections cannot claim to fully represent the whole truth and nothing but the truth, regardless of how truth is perceived and articulated, or even the whole story with all its characters, plots, and twists. At best, the archives offer, if only, content that it gives details, or at best, answers to hard-pressed questions. In other words, archives are supposed to give meanings to societal questions. And Chile Mbembe, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, offers another sobering consideration. No archive can be the depository of the entire history of a society, of all that has happened in that society. Through archival documents, we are presented with pieces of time to be assembled, fragments of life to be placed in order, one after the other, in an attempt to formulate a story that acquires its coherence through the archivist's ability to craft links between the beginning and the end. Therefore, we need to respect and include those memory forms outside the repository to give full meaning to the materials within the repository. This could be applied to redefining our Caribbean archival context. There are archives or parts of the archives that are not institutionalized. Jeanette Bastion, and you'll hear me refer to her, we work together, we are still working together. In 2023, her work, Archiving Cultures, Heritage, Community, and the Making of Records and Memory, makes a powerful statement, and I love it. Every culture is an archiving culture. It's as simple as that. Whether it's folk dance, religious festivals, formal dance, theater, music parades or celebrations, performance is a powerful evoker and transmitter of cultural knowledge. Thus, the concept of archives, especially Caribbean archives, must include orality, movement, objects, continuity in practice. In short, and hopefully by the end of this symposium, we will agree that the archives are not a format, but a meaning. If I must go further to share an ongoing project I'm working with Jeanette, out of conversations on the perceived textuality of archives came a project investigating this idea of intangible archives. In our call for submissions, we pondered this question. In the primary text-driven archival discipline, intangible expressions are too often discounted as records. And yet, these expressions created by societies worldwide and in multiple formats are carriers of significant information, recorders in themselves of a variety of beliefs, history, culture, and heritage. Orality, performance, social practices, rituals, festivals, traditional knowledge and practices, and craftsmanship are all aspects of intangible culture, but to what extent, the question we ask, are they also significant archives of the societies that produce them? These questions seemingly hit a nerve, as the response was diverse and international. We got 86. By the time we finished, it was 90-something submissions for a one-volume book that now became 2 volumes. Yet it begs the question of what Caribbean archives should expect of what Caribbean people should expect of their archives. Dr. Lorraine Nero, an extraordinary Caribbean librarian, shared in her address to the Caribbean Archival Conference in 2023 that in determining what is archives for us as Caribbean societies, we too must also be careful not to use the same archival colonial lens instituted by colonialism, as well as our own personal biases or the politics of the day to ascribe archival value. For another theorist I'm head over heels in love with, in the 1970s, Gerald Ham wrote, "Our most important and intellectually demanding task as archivists is to make an informed selection of information that will provide the future with," and the favorite part of the quote, "with a representative record of human experience in our time. I'm not responsible for the person who was before me, but I'm responsible as archivist for my time. And hopefully when I walk off, the next one will pick up by ensuring there's a representative record in their time." Every appraisal decision we make, Lorraine argues, shapes the future lens through which the records are used and our societies are viewed. We cannot limit ourselves and the ways in which we document ourselves, as we are not and have not limited the ways in which we create, use, and memorialize our narratives, stories, and expressions. We can't limit our creativity to crop over in the festival. The ways in which we do record keeping, the ways in which we do memory, the ways in which we preserve ourselves must reflect that creativity. Our creativity must inspire and be reflected in the archives. Both the SAA and ISRG definitions on extent emphasize the physical counting or representation of how large the collection under processing is. In other words, I want us to put a philosophical twist to this question. Given the diversity found in the Caribbean, what limits can we put on how much can be considered archival? For us in the region, the archives is living, open-ended, always being created, but most importantly, always meaningful. For as John Aarons and Jeanette Bastian wrote, in considering how to archive Caribbean identity, go look it up, it's a book. To move Caribbean archives away, we must embrace a wider range of expressions, materials, and even methods for considering the value and safeguarding the heritage of the ways in which Caribbean people have long documented ourselves. In order to move Caribbean archives further away from its colonial beginnings and towards a definition that reflects the dynamic cultural life and lived experiences of the region. Allow me then to explain further. For us in the Caribbean, the published, the unpublished, and the object cannot be considered the only sources of information. Chances are, this is the problem we have with history and history writing. One of the questions I asked, first class, 601, first week, is the decline in history and interest in history a problem of the historians or a problem of the archives? If the archives have nothing new to offer the historians and they may have nothing to write. It's as simple as that. We have other sources that are, according to Richard Levy, are talking things, activities, expressions, materials that inform and create information that are inherently Caribbean, that are outside of the institutional interests and mandates. Borrowing from librarianship, there's an interesting concept called an information ecosystem. The information ecosystem defines all structures, entities, and agents related to the flow of semantic information. Again, information that is meaningful to people, relevant to a research domain, as well as to the information itself. I like this definition because it declares that our interest must be in information that is meaningful to people. The value of an archive is in its use and not its storage. If there is no meaning to people, what's the point? It recognizes all the forms and ways of information working together to inform Caribbean life. Friends or archives must be filled with information that is meaningful to our societies, in formats that are culturally appropriate, relevant, and accessible to the very people who created these records. Now, follow me for a moment as we reflect, for example, on the beginning of life in the Caribbean. When a child is born, documentation begins long before a formal record is created. In Jamaica, families may plant a baby tree, sometimes placing the child's umbilical cord at its roots. The tree becomes a marker, a living marker of family heritage and belonging. And in some parts of Jamaica, when it's time for death, you return to the family plot to be buried. The living tree, the birth tree, the grave, the land being that entire historical representation of a family. The tree is a birth certificate, the grave is a death certificate. You get it? Across the region, storytelling also documents identity. The Venerable Louise Bennett Coverley's poem, New Scholar, reminds us as to how Caribbean people often describe themselves through context, relationships, and lived experience, rather than by dates and forms. Can this video be played?
Scholar by Louise Bennett. Good morning, teacher. How is you? My name is Sarah Cool. This is Timmy Lily Boy Michael. I'm just bringing my school. Even one rainy Mom, it was coming on tonight. Okay, baby girl, pretty picture. For this one was a sight. In the week when Rufus Jackson treated Stocky Bear. It's that same month of the big day. but me forgot the year.
Right? Described the total environment, the pig, the da-da-da, but she can't remember the year. If you've ever talked to nurses beside hospital beds, trying to get information, school teachers at registration, all right? You're getting them kind of stories. They can't tell you the date the child born, but they could tell you everything else. Eventually, the state records a child through a birth certificate, a document shaped by colonialism that reflects not only identity but changing ideas of citizenship and nationhood. Yet, community rituals also matter. In Trinidad and Tobago, the Hindu Barahi ceremony formally welcomes the child into culture, faith, and community life. A student wrote these are ideas from students, these are mine. These are the research from our students. Once the student who did this project came out of her own personal experience, where she went to a funeral of a relative, and an old lady said, "Who is you? You did not have a Barahi." She has a birth certificate, but culturally she did not exist. Each of these records tell a different story. The tree connects the child to land and family. The stories connect the child to memory and language. The certificate connects the child to the nation. The ritual connects the child to culture and community. And there is yet another layer, social media. Increasingly, Caribbean children begin life not only in ceremonies, archives, and communities, but also online. All this creativity and dynamism must somehow make its way to the archives. The materials of the archives can no longer just be paper-based, lying in boxes, or even being digitized and digitally born materials accessible online. There must be ways to bring these living, talking things into the documentary heritage circle. Now, I've been toying with this idea that the future Caribbean archives is really a wheel of memory, or a hub of memory networks, or memory layers, bringing together multiple memory practices and information forms into accessibility and social and societal appreciation. Within this series of related parts, this interconnected cycle of memory sources gives society access to meanings. I want us to consider the textual records as items of memory, archival institutions as houses of memory, communal environments as landscapes of memory, performers and their performative activities as performance of memory, community work, community memory workers as gatherers of memory, and the online web-based domain as a digital form of memory. You may notice I use the preposition of rather than the functional preposition as. I want to emphasize that memory has many parts and expressions, a multi-dimensional concept articulated in multiple ways. Yet each expression is an equal part of the whole memory, not a mere illustration or portrayal in a place of the memory. For I like how Pierre Noir puts it, what we call memory is in fact the gigantic and breathtaking storehouse of material stock of what it would be impossible for us to remember, an unlimited repertoire of what might need to be recalled. Each memory part offers a unique perspective and a particular sliver that must be opened and made accessible. Allow me to focus on two parts, gatherers of memory and digital memory. Building on the premise that memory is performed and localized, I want us to consider the role of community archiving in this wheel of memory. Community archival work recognizes two strands of thought in the memory practice of a people. Firstly, there is, as Jeanette describes, a community of records, a unique series of correlated practices and performances, structures, content, and context that give each community its set definitions of records. These are records that are specifically for and about and practiced by the specific community. For example, and you get this, pay attention at carnival time or crop over time. A calypso song has its communal expectation, A communal expected sound, rhythm, tones, and must be performed in particular contexts to be defined and described as a calypso. We have had instances where the man singers, but I know calypso, that is something else. We have a set understanding of what our records are supposed to look, sound, and feel like. Within the series of community records are the narratives that form the basis of identity, which culturalist Simon During states can take the form of straightforward identification of certain events, generally traumatic ones, as defining current ways of life and structures of feeling. Anthropologists Fogg, Ulwick, and Besson goes further by asserting these narratives are tactics of the weak to gain power, or at least a certain modicum of control over their lives. Recognizing these community of records is crucial for appreciating the tenets of a community's memory and the methodologies applicable and ethically appropriate for access and engagement. In other words, you can't bring, and I say this all the time, if I were to apply my strict Dundee training to appraising calypso, right, it would never equate. We must understand what is archival for a community for that value to be ascribed to that activity. The second aspect is community archives being the work of those who recognize and seek to encourage community members to appreciate the value, the archival value of their community's expressions and activities, and in so doing, create opportunities to safeguard those memory practices. I refer to them for these purposes as the gatherers of community memory, folks like HeritEdge. This builds on the customary definition of the community archives, which Andrew Flynn and Mary Stevens maintain. The moment when the archives is created and named is such a moment of reflection and often a response to other societal conditions. It is an act of resistance against subordination and discrimination. The act of creating or gathering memory to form an access point, if not a repository, is therefore a means of recognizing and making available the value of one's community's history, voices, and narratives. As Victor Gray says, the gathering community memory is an important part of the overall archival attempt to capture the totality, the history of a society in all its diversity, supporting community capacity, building and promoting a sense of place and identity. Chances are, this is where first contact between archivists and community practitioners meet. The ability to see archival value in practice, and for one's community to see their practice as archival. That is a challenge. The diversity in the holdings now depend on the recognition, inclusion, vitality, and sustainability of community archives and their leadership. Now, if I may, for a few, focus on digital memory. Digital memory is the latest method and space in which people are self-documenting. There are now endless video clips, photographs, and other forms of digital content featuring Caribbean people and their cultural lifestyles online. This is nothing new or strange in any way. It is now commonplace to click on one's phone camera and record. Digital technology has given the user, consumer, the privilege of self-documenting moments they appraise as valuable. Whether fleeting or enduring, the creator, or should I say the creative, has the privilege and power to capture, maintain, disseminate, and preserve their memories. In reflecting on the impact and value of digital memory, I wish to use the selfie as a metaphor for our consideration. Everybody knows a selfie, right? Mm-hmm. On showing society that they possess archives, and we, the archives, need access to their memory. Susan Boresma argues in her article on social media, the concept of the selfie is a way of documenting memories with a unique ability to foster the creation of our own narratives. The image is to become part of an individual collection of memories, presenting the past which shapes the decisions made for the future. Now, Doesn't that sound like the definition of an archival record? Unlike institutional mandate or the interest of the archivist or the policy of some organization, the individual has full control over keeping, deleting, or taking the pick over. Burisma goes further. The individual automatically documents their memories. The selfie taker makes a record of the fact that they were there or they are friends of those other individuals. As a result, they develop an individual narrative which relates them to their surroundings. The selfie, despite being self-referential, would not exist without the involvement of others. It aids the self-identification by the individual, but also immediately relates to others and their identities. Friends, we may think that the selfie is too humble a record for the interest of a National Archival Institute or a small community archives. But such is the nature of memory. It is in the small mundane acts of remembrance, or according to definition, the byproduct of human activity, meeting with friends, wearing new clothes, recording one's thoughts, that the selfie as an archival record becomes in need of preservation, and that becomes a need for our attention. Now, please note that I'm not advocating a collection called for selfies. But I'm strongly suggesting that where the house of memory is seen as static, bearing only items and expressions of memory of pre-digital selfie days, that is, the pre-20th century, byproduct of stuff of life, then we must make a concerted effort to show society that the archives is literally within their hands, literally on their phones. And the archives has the capacity to care for digital memory. If we do not show society how valuable and archival their selfies, their digital content, their 21st century creativity are, then we as archivists will be failing, again, in what Gerald Ham states is our greatest intellectual challenge in selecting information that will preserve a representative record of human experience for future generations. Now I'm wrapping up. I'm accustomed to 3-hour lectures, so this is a challenge. Bear with me. I want us to notice two realities. The items on the wheel and the houses can easily be perceived by society as the only authoritative archival materials and spaces. The institution with its official materials is the archives and must be kept. This currently, quite frankly, is the attitude of our societies. However, we are already recognizing that the other elements on the wheel, the landscape, the performance, the gathering, the digital, are outside the official scope and mandate of the customary archive. One should also note that these expressions have been long considered archival by non-writing cultures for generations. And through the excellent thought leadership from indigenous culturalists and archivists from the Pacific area especially, we can be encouraged to move our archival lens away from Eurocentric items and houses of memory to the living beings on the street, to recognize and appreciate the vibrant elements living, breathing, and documenting themselves outside of our repository walls. Evelyn Warham puts it this way: in any community, collective memory is supported through a mosaic. Collective memory is supported through a mosaic of different forms. It represents a few tattered strands in a finely woven mat of sources for interpretation of communities' histories and identities, their rights and entitlements. Their strands are interwoven with stories, songs, dances, myths, and traditions passed through generations by word of mouth. So when we embrace all the elements on the wheel of memory, we give access to meanings, since each element documents and preserves aspects of the story according to their format and tradition. I therefore want to believe the future of archival access is really about finding and giving meanings. Content creation, manipulation, and preservation, easy now, and is available outside the archives. What is still required is the archival thought, skill, and capability to be the guiding hand towards showing the users meanings, the reasons behind and for the archival moment and document. These are the lessons I think we can learn from the Wheel of Memory. Now, I'm wrapping up. Finally, if we are to redefine the identity, materials, and services of Caribbean archives, including community archives, we must touch on the very controversial yet necessary issue about the capacity to care for our own documentary heritage. I believe, given my regional vantage point as the only idiot in town, who has practically trained the next generation of archivists, all 58 of them, I still have their student papers. If our collective aim is to make the West Indian archives West Indian, there are three major issues that we must face. One, we must build capacity for local accessibility. The reality is, as a lecturer of archival studies, it is easier, and there is more Caribbean archival content accessible from global northern sources than trying to access our own local institutions. The inequalities of the past still shape how our archival institutions are functioning. Not only are our materials held in places where many of us can't afford to go or have the wherewithal to access those materials held in jurisdictions with institutional policies that may not necessarily be favorable to our citizens and their documentary heritage needs. As I shared in one conversation with a researcher wanting digital access to the materials, the convenience of digital access is enabled by a host of back-end resources: servers, staffing, funding, processing. Digitization. Currently, I have colleagues who can't keep the electricity going to maintain preservation standards. Online services fall way below on the to-do list when the daily operational needs are waning. Friends, lots have been written by several colleagues about the challenges of accessibility for research and, more importantly, identification when one's archival founding documents are out of one's reach. Jeanette and I did a paper arguing that there is this greater challenge, and it is psychosocial. One's humanity is diminished by this access gap. We have called a concept the archival dignity. There's a concept called archival dignity, which validates a community's experiences, history, and identities. When a community have their own archives, and we've seen it, when they have their own space, there's a dignity, a sense of self, a sense of pride that comes to bear, especially when compared to others who don't have that access. That is why community archiving is vital. Above all, it provides a means to access one's own past and presence and to share their own determination of their futures. We must encourage at all costs and times that our archival materials remain in the region and in our territorial jurisdictions, and to have some kind of relationship with national institutions. I've said this time and time again. I am fearful that our national repositories are becoming shells. We scoff and laugh and ridicule the British Museum for the legacy of their practices. But quite frankly, if you read some of the digitization projects and some of the projects that are happening around the region, it is just as, dare I say, criminal. There's not a month that don't go by that I get some kind of access, some kind of invitation to either support a kind of project or help somebody find some kind of collection for these kinds of projects. And we've seen it time and time again. When the materials are digitized, the firewalls go up. They may even have the manners to put on the website that this comes from you. You become a shell of what you once owned. I am fearful. Where will my 58 graduates go if all they are keeping can be found online in another institution's website, in their database, with no acknowledgement of the context, content, or structure that created those materials? Secondly, we must bear to mind the capacity to care rests on the quality and standard of caregivers. We cannot continue to have underqualified, and I'm not knocking nobody, these are my colleagues. Right? These are the people I work with. Sometimes these are the people I have to advocate for. You know, because I is a doctor in the room. Right? We cannot continue to have underqualified, under-resourced, and quite frankly, unempowered staff overseeing our documentary heritage. Our advancement rests on the improvement of our human resources, ensuring that they have the requisite technical skills and theoretical knowledge to be the much-needed record keepers the region needs and deserves. The legal and technological environments of yesteryear are no longer the same. We must take responsibility for protecting, if nothing else, both legally and technologically, our data and information sovereignty. It can't be just about the flag, the national anthem, and who is a president or GG. Our records are part of our sovereignty. Collaborative efforts in digital resourcing must be predicated on the principles and basis of territorial jurisprudence and reparatory justice. Shared heritage, and I've written about this. Shared heritage ain't shared if the relationship ain't equitable. Finally, we need our archival institutions empowered both legally and visibly in the society that they serve. Too many times in my experience, those who are doing literal community archival work do not see their activities and holdings as complementary and connected and relevant to the building down the road called the National Archives. Now, I am not advocating for national institutional ownership of all archival materials, as some sectors would have, practiced and stipulated by law. However, I would love to see the National Archives having more and deeper partnership with community archives. After all, the content related to the nation's history and the National Archives should be seen as a key stakeholder in the cultural proprietorship of a nation. The ownership of the culture just shouldn't rest at the Ministry of Culture. All right? Yes, we must renew the profound relationship between archives and society and its memory. Community archiving work with enablers such as Heritage Connection will certainly push Caribbean archival materials into greater relevance. We can no longer allow the archives to be perceived as mere repositories of historical curiosities and wonders, but as dynamic reflections of the cultures, identities, power dynamics, and social justice struggles of their times. We must provide access to meanings, not just materials. Our archives must be West Indian in order to, our Caribbean archives must be Caribbean and in the Caribbean in order to be relevant to us in the Caribbean. In conclusion, I usually end with this admonition from Stuart Hall. We need to ensure our society sees themselves in our items, houses, landscapes, performances, gatherings, and digital memory, and feel invited, included, seen, and remembered in their archives. Anything less is to perpetuate, via documentary abuse, quite frankly, the injustices of yesteryear. I want to offer my best wishes to Heritage Connection in their efforts to support and make our Caribbean community memory more accessible to us all. And may we be more strident and deliberate, agitate, right? Educate, federate, to keep our archives ours. Thank you very much.